I was stunned. They were telling me the Burro Woman was dead. Stunned and touched in a way I hadn't been since Uncle Joe passed. Staring up at the sky in one of those pauses where the vague of ultimate questions, softly quaking, spirals up, opening out and out. What a part of us she'd become. She was supposed to be out there forever, moving in that space that somehow connected us back to some essential freedom within ourselves, a freedom that had become one of the essential reasons why we continue to live on at the edge of this nowhere. Maybe that's a little too high put. After all, she was just Judy, the Burro Woman, refusing all that we would project onto her, fiercely particular of her ways, always insisting on pain, shunting aside all talk of her past, for over 20 years plying the highways, from Sanderson to Sierra Blanca, and sometimes far beyond. Weren't we surprised to hear that she'd made it all the way to Columbus, New Mexico, Terlingua and Lajitas and the River Road, crossing and recrossing the vastness of our Big Bend at burro speed, as Ivy so aptly put it the day we buried her. The blankets and serapes that draped the burro becoming her improvised lean-to shelter at night, always out in it, regardless the weather, linking up in our psyches, or maybe even creating, what shall we call it? A shadow self who was always out there with her, moving through a kind of companion soul landscape that would superimpose itself on the literal, the physical of her trekking. Again, maybe a little too arched, but why else were we always so reassured, smiling for miles after when we'd catch a glimpse after a long absence of not seeing her out on 90 or 18 or Farm Road 170? Or finding her sitting in a booth of one of those convenience stores, gas stations she frequented, sitting in a kind of stoic splendor of a crazy ordinariness, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup, eating a donut, the burro hitched outside. As Summer put it to me at the funeral, you know, you grow up with all these ideas and hopes and plans, and then somehow they all start getting compromised and complicated with jobs and marriage and children, and before you know it, you're doing none of what you started out to do. And then you'd look up, and there she'd be, plodding along, straight up in the saddle, a tight black thrift store of a sport coat over layerings of clothes, like an old Indian princess, a hat that wasn't quite a top hat, more a cone of a hat, chopped off at the top, fringed with sheepskin and slouched down, covering most of her face, the thin, firm set of the lips, strong jaw, and skin like weathered cobblestones. Simply out in it all, beyond all that shreds us so constantly to such distraction, living exactly how we suppose she wanted to live. Free. Years ago when I was doing park tours and we'd be a few miles out of old Lajitas, standing in front of the bus and mic'd, I'd say, "Okay, folks, look out, what do you see?" And they'd crane their necks trying to see something. But there was nothing, at least back then, but shelvings of Boquillas flag mixed with alluvium, greasewood and lechuguilla. And I'd say, that's what we have a lot of out here, this nothing. And as the rest of the world fills up with all those somethings, this nothing becomes more and more special. A little piece of the Tourmouse shtick. But how to speak of that space she rode in? It's like some essential part of ourselves that we're always reaching for, especially here in Terlingua, that's always out there, whispering the edges. I pace upon the battlements and stare, where moon rising submerges us to that old sea, and the ancient Mexican, accordion in hand, comes forth to stand a corner of the entrance, bending to the heart bellows of the song, and the impenetrable paths appear. Or that old, crazy Scot, a walking bob kind of man, kilt and bagpipes disappearing over the hill, leaving behind that wild heartsickness of sound that calls to us, twisting back through the centuries. It is said that one has to give up all he has if he would be his disciple. For Castañeda's Don Juan, it wasn't one or the other, but a commerce back and forth between the two. I'm sure she would have disavowed any and all of the above in connection to her. She was more of a minimalist than Judd, just at the other end of the spectrum. But then we really don't know. Aside from the chosen few with whom she chatted at times, she turned aside all approach, all questions. She simply was, simply went out into it with a certain stunning purity. While all this other ran after her, kicking up the moon dust, tenuously reaching for the deeper soundings, as her journey became a part of our own on some altering parallel track. Back in the 70s, this young man appeared at the Studi Boot store with an American flag sewn across his pack and a fey light about his shoulders. He'd been out in the desert alone for months. I invited him to spend the night at the adobe I was renting from Daisy at the Fulcher Ranch on Lower Creek. And as we sat out under the stars, he said, "Come with me. In 7 days I will show you the universe." The next morning I walked with him to the bend in the creek where the cottonwoods grow and bade him farewell. He disappeared into the unpathed, and I never saw him again, although at times I still think about the invitation. Of course, the variations are innumerable, both here and in the rest of the world, one of the current being a reprise in film of McCandless in Alaska and Into the Wild. But few can match the purity and steadiness of Judy, never hyping her image, if anything, always playing it the other way, and always so essentially alone, except for the burro, alone in that way we always are with that part of the soul. So it was like wildfire, the word spreading as we walked up to the graveyard to bury her, that there were children, grown children, 5 of them sitting on small metal folding chairs in front of the coffin in the gaping hole. Of course there'd been stories, suicides or deaths or killings. What I'd heard in the 80s when she first made that beach camp down from the hoodoos was that she was a burned out dropout from Hare Krishna. But whatever it was, she shut the door on it, chose that aloneness and that ride, although one has to wonder at all the payphones she passed in all those years. Was there ever a time she paused, coin in hand? But it only throws in the greater relief what she did choose, especially watching Kimmy break off from a single stem the 5 desert daisies to give one to each of the grown children, maintaining through all those years, and at what cost the gain, that singleness of intent. Sometimes at night I like to think that there are all these little groupings of candles out there, like they do where people have died. But these would be at all the places she bivouacked through the years. Thousands of little lit clusters of candles across the Big Bend, flickering lightly in the night wind.